Ladies and gentlemen, please give me your attention. Before I introduce today's speaker, I would like to announce next month's program because I want to have a chance to do so later. Our next Lunch and Learn will be again on a Monday on December the 2nd. It's going to be a rather unusual program. It's not going to be in the form of a lecture. It's going to be in the form of an artistic presentation. We have a Staten Island artist whose name is Carol Hersfeld, who is going to be our guest lecturer, who is a sculptor, and she created 10 images from recycled paper, most unusual kind of thing. I saw them, I could not believe it. And the title of the series is Chesed, because each of these pieces of art represents a different institution of kindness that we normally find in a Jewish community. She's going to be here. She will have the sculptures for you to look at. She will introduce them and explain them to them. So please remember, you can put it on your calendar on Monday, December the 2nd. The lecturer today is Rabbi Benjamin Yablok.
December 2nd is on Monday.
Did I say Wednesday?
7th.
Monday, December the 2nd.
No, can't be. It's Tuesday.
December 1st is a Tuesday.
December 1st is a Tuesday.
Oh, so I think that maybe it's going to be on a Wednesday instead of a Monday. Thank you. Okay, we'll tell you it'll be on a Wednesday, December the 2nd. Pardon?
What was that date again?
What should I be? Today's lecturer is Rabbi Benjamin Yablok, who is a master educator. He's been teaching in day schools for many, many years. For the past 25 years, he was the headmaster, the principal of the Manhattan Day School, and he just retired a few years ago. In addition to his teaching, he is also a lecturer in history in a most unusual way. He lectures on a variety of topics of historical significance, but he's also a collector of memorabilia and of artifacts, which he uses to illustrate his presentations. A very, very unusual kind of a presentation. So it is my pleasure to introduce to you Rabbi Benjamin Yablok. Rabbi.
Thank you.
Good luck. Take it.
All right. Shalom, everyone. It's nice to see you all. I appreciate you having me here to do something that I love to do, which is to talk about the world of Jewish life, history, behavior, experiences, and always connected to some artifacts. I realize that there are parts of Jewish life that don't lend themselves to artifacts. So whenever I make a presentation, there will be some things there and some things not. But it has always been interesting to me to hold a coin or a stamp or a document or a passport in my hand and to feel that this thing was there, and somehow it connects me to what happened at that time and place. And I have tried to weave this hobby, or mishigas, as some would say, into my teaching, and I have found that students respond to it nicely. So perhaps you too will enjoy. Should the computer just go on and behave with us? Perhaps you too will enjoy the artifacts that I am showing you today. I was born in Marietta, Ohio, a very small town with barely and rarely a minion. But my parents sent me at a very early age, 5th grade, to New York City to get a Jewish education. And so from there I went on the track high school and yeshiva, college, rabbinics, graduate school, and so on, in more or less the YU style of philosophy. Now, I'm not a Sephardi. My parents are from Poland and from Polish Russia, respectively. So I don't have the real deal. My sister married a Sephardi whose family came from Turkey. And my wife's sister married a Sephardi whose family came from Rhodes, which was associated with Greece. And I became acquainted with behaviors, customs, expressions, styles, sometimes the foods. And at a certain point, I added that to my collecting. So that in addition to collecting everything I could about Israel and its struggle for a land, and everything that I've collected about the Shoah and what came before and after, and my collection of autographs of all the prime ministers of Israel, and my collection of chicken plumbas, the little kosher tags that come on kosher meat. You could learn a lot from plumbas. And my collection of Jewish campaign buttons for various presidents and also Rands. And my collection of stamps from America and stamps from Israel. I decided I wanted to collect artifacts from each major Sephardic community that really existed in Arab lands and is pretty much gone. At best, moved to somewhere else, but has lost its home setting and with it a lot of its culture. And so I set out to acquire assorted items from each of a dozen communities. And I looked for a rabbinic letter. I looked for a Hebrew book printed there. I looked for business envelopes from Jews in business. I looked for schools. I looked for yeshivas. I looked for rabbis. I looked for clothing represented on postcards and so on. And I wanted to just show that Jews had been alive and well and thriving in all of these communities. Now, I can't show you 12 communities worth of items today, but I want to show you some, and I want to also use a variety of them to point out some interesting features of Sephardic life. Let me just get this to go.
Marty, it's freezing here.
Okay.
It's freezing. It's freezing here.
All right, we're ready to look at the images now. And here we go. So to start with, it's useful to reflect on how much of what we do today was contributed by people from the Sephardic world over the years. When you think of Jewish scholarship, you just about can't learn Chumash without these commentaries, or Mishnah without the Rabbeinu Ovadia, or Gemara. When I learned Gemara in Yeshiva University, you had to look at the Ramban, you had to look at the Rashba, you had to look at the Ritva. These were all of the medieval commentators necessary to understand what the Gemara was talking about, all Sephardic. In Halacha, the major work of the Rambam, and of course the Shulchan Aruch, that every Jew in every community somehow lives by. In Tefillah, there are a lot of different types of Tefillah and Sidurim, but the first Siddur in the world was really an answer to a question. The question was, what should we daven every day? The question was posed by Jews in Spain, and they didn't have an authoritative answer from their local community, so they sent the question all the way to Iraq, to Bavel. And over there, the Gaon, Rav Amron, heading a yeshiva in Bavel, sent them back a letter, which is the Siddur of Rav Amram. And that's the first Siddur in the world, as far as we know. By the way, almost all the Zemirot that you might sing at the Shabbat table were written by Sephardic composers. And we could talk about poetry and philosophy and grammar, all things that they were expert in. And then there are these people, you may recognize some of these names, from very different walks of life, every single one from a Sephardic background. You have philosophers and spies and poets and performers, patriots, lawyers, judges, Confederates, hairdressers. Yes. They're not only Jewish, they're Sephardic. So, okay, I just wanted to kind of make the point that for many Ashkenazim, these are kind of unknown things. Where do Sephardim come from? Well, they come from Spain and Portugal, and were exiled in 1492 by the Catholic king and queen of the country, and again in Portugal in 1497, and needed to either leave, convert, or go into hiding, pretty much. But that's an easy question to answer. A harder question to answer is where they came from to get to Spain. And there's not one clear answer about that. But it seems that there were Jews in Spain after the Roman destruction of the temple and the conquest of Judea, and the Roman Empire had spread out all over Europe, and Jews tended to go there too, and we know that we've had Jews in the early part of the Common Era. Where did they go after they left Spain? Well, they went all over the place. North Africa, which is geographically right nearby, so you have Morocco, Tunisia, Algeria, Libya, Egypt, the whole Mediterranean southern coast. Or east, as far as Eretz Yisrael, and further as far as Iraq, Iran, and India. Or they went north into Europe, and even west to the New World. Nowadays, the term Sephardic blurs, and you don't know for sure what you're talking about. Jews from Iraq and Iran and Afghanistan and Yemen should have had nothing to do with Spain. But the truth is that there were Jews from Spain who ended up in these areas or influenced them. And so sometimes it's hard to tell the difference. But there is a term, Edot HaMizrach, which means communities of the East, which is sometimes applied to these. And nowadays in Israel, sometimes people that were called Sephardim are called Mizrahim. In the 12th century, they were 90% of the world Jewish population. Amazing. But they lost ground, in a sense. Not that they died out any more than the Ashkenazim did, but that the Ashkenazim apparently at some point became more fruitful and multiplied. And so by 1930, you had this huge amount of Jews in Eastern Europe, and by contrast, the percentage dropped. Nowadays, it's estimated that they're 20% of world Jewry, but in Israel, they're probably a good 60%.
Is there a reason why they decrease the Sephardim? Why they decrease in amount?
They didn't decrease in numbers, they decreased in percentage. Because more Ashkenazim, so the percentage changed.
Rabbi?
Yes. Sure.
Can I just add, why did they go with in South America?
Why did they go to...
There's quite a few
You are right. When I said west to the New World, I meant that as well. And you're absolutely right. Thank you. Somehow skipped something.
Do you feel that their numbers decreased Sephardim, or that they became more because they moved out of Spain, they went into Eastern Europe, that they just sort of became Ashkenazi?
My point is not that they became fewer, but that the Ashkenazic population exploded, and so the percentage of them in the world out of the whole Jewish population became smaller. Not that they became fewer, the Ashkenazim multiplied. Now the term Sephardic comes from the word Sfarad. And that word appears exactly one time in the whole Tanakh, and it's in this pasuk in the Sefer Ovadia, a book that has one parak, and there you could see that Ovadia is talking about the future ingathering of exiles, and he talks about the Galut Yerushalayim Asher B'Sfarad. So that's kind of interesting. It suggests that the Jews in Spain came from Yerushalayim. The problem is that it's not so clear that Sfarad meant Spain back in the day of Ovadia. In fact, many scholars think it meant someplace in Turkey. But the Targum Yonasan, the Aramaic translation of this pasuk, says, Ad here Vigalut Yerushalayim de Ispamia. And Ispamia is already understood to mean Spain. Even in Spain, Spain is called España. It has an in front of it.
What does it mean, Bespad, Yushu, and
Where are you?
What does it mean?
Yershu will inherit, at Arei HaNegev, will come and inherit the cities of the south. I just wanted to make the point of where the word comes from. And of course, as we know, when Jews left Spain, they went to all these many places. And in doing so, partly maintained their traditions and partly changed them and blended in with the locals. So here you see the Sephardim going east, also north, also west, to the Americas, north and south. And as for that matter, those that arrived in the Middle East also went their various ways. And meantime, the Ashkenazim are spreading out in Europe. These two stamps of Israel showing great rabbinic leaders show a contrast. This is the late Lubavitcher Rebbe. I call him late. There are those who. This is Yisrael Abu Chatzera, who is known as Baba Sali, Morocco, with the traditional Moroccan clothing, and a very powerful figure in Sephardic life. And you see the contrast in the look and the feel. Somebody made a painting. I don't think these three people ever sat on a bench together, but somebody made a painting, because paintings are wonderful. And this is Rav Ovadia Yosef, Alav HaShalom, and his style of chief rabbi clothing. This is Baba Sali and his Moroccans. And this is Rav Kaduri, a mystical leader, in his Iraqi clothing. So you get a sense of the exotic and interesting style of clothing. These are the recent chief rabbis of Israel. Here you have the very Ashkenazi style, and you have the traditional Sephardi style maintained.
What's the name on the left?
I beg your pardon?
What was the name on the left?
This is Rabbi Metzger, the past chief rabbi Ashkenazi. And this is Rabbi Amar, who was the past Sephardi. Now Rabbi Amar's son, I think, is now the current chief. Oh, it's Rabbi Lau's son. No, he's the Ashkenazi, but Rabbi Amar's son, I think, is the Sephardi. So those are the two, continuing the tradition. Interesting, In the Sephardic world, it's very common to kiss the hand of the rabbi, of any rabbi. Sometimes when I would walk into school, students in the school, Sephardic students, would come and kiss my hand. And certainly when their fathers came to school, I felt a little, like, who am I? But this was their showing of respect.
So in shul in Israel, where we go on the Moshav, it's
Yeah.
a Sephardic shul,
Yeah.
everybody kisses everybody's hand. When it's Shabbos, they say goodbye or something.
Well, that sounds just a little more democratized.
I see.
But it was really reserved for the rabbi of the shul.
Okay,
Yeah.
because everybody-
And here you have Prime Minister of Israel shaking the hand of the Sephardic chief rabbi in the Ashkenazi style rather than in the Sephardi kissing style. Prime Minister of Israel. Yes. Just to make the point, this is England, and this is the rabbi, this is the immediate former chief rabbi of England, this is the current one. This is an outgoing rabbi of the shul of the Bevis Marks Sephardic Spanish-Portuguese synagogue in London. And this is the incoming rabbi, just to show you their style of clothing, which is very much not 21st century. It's left over from the 1600s. And you would find that style in Amsterdam in the Sephardic community. You would find it in New York City in the Spanish-Portuguese synagogue. You would find it in London. They maintain their own Western Sephardic habits. We tend to think of Sephardim as being more olive-skinned and more Middle Eastern types, although, of course, well, that's partly true. It's something of a stereotype. Here you have a collection of YU boys with their pink cheeks and more Ashkenazi-style complexion. Now, this is an interesting point. See, my sister does not cook with kitniot when I come to visit her on Pesach. Kitniot is beans which can be ground into a flour. And when they're ground into a flour, how do you know if this flour is bean flour or wheat flour? So the rabbis in the Ashkenazi community said, let's stay away from beans. So we don't eat kitniot on Pesach. But Sephardim never adopted that restriction, and so they are comfortable eating these products on Pesach. So it's tricky when you're going to a home of such a family. Yes?
The difference
Excuse me,
is
we
because
don't
the
eat that.
Mizrahim in all the Moyen-Orient, they eat a lot of kitniot. They don't have all the vegetable and things. As those, the Mizrahim eat kitniot,
Yeah.
and the Sephardim don't eat kitniot. Don't eat kitniot.
It's only rice.
They Turkish, they eat rice? Okay, thank you. I heard that when the rabbis realized you could make flour out of potatoes, they wanted to say no potatoes on Pesach. And there was an uprising because if there weren't potatoes, what would you eat? So, yeah, let them eat schmaltz. Sephardic synagogues tend to look different in their layout. This is a Spanish-Portuguese in New York City. They have the teva in the back here where people read from, and in the front where the Torahs are kept, and you sort of have a theater of operations here between the two, and everybody is facing in to look. I have seen Ashkenazic shuls that have copied this, but it's not an Ashkenazic style. It's a very much Sephardic style. And in Eastern countries, the Sephardim sat every which way. They had benches, but they didn't necessarily face in any special direction, at least not until they got to the Amidah. The Rambam says that in his communities, which would be Spain and then Egypt, people sat on the floor, which would be a lot like what probably the Muslims were doing. There are no chairs in a Muslim mosque. Everything is right on the carpets. But I think people graduated to benches anyway. Here's another, this is a Tunisian synagogue, and you see the seats are going every which way. There is no special orientation. Now the Sephardim, certain communities use these beautiful cases for the Torah, and they close together into a cylinder, and you open them up when you're showing the Torah. And they have an interesting custom that not everybody can reach the Torah, especially when it's off in that case. So they sort of do a long distance kiss by holding up their finger or even their tzitziot, and they point to the Torah and then they kiss it. This is something that you mainly see in Sephardic communities. Here's another example. Somebody's doing it right here because they can't reach. By the way, it's kind of interesting how you would read from a Torah like this, which you can't lay it down on the table very well, so they don't. It stands up on a flat stand, and you read it vertically. It might be hard to get used to if you were raised Ashkenazi, but once you learn how, it's the same words, and it's not really hard to do. Tefillin are tied differently on the hand. Ashkenazim tie it this way, some tie with the shin going in the other direction, but they make this shin on their hand. Sephardim, I have seen almost universally have this style here, which goes across this way and that way. Another interesting thing is that Ashkenazim put on tefillin, they put on the hand part standing and the head part standing. But Sephardim put the hand part on sitting down. This nice boy posed for me. His father is a chazan in a Moroccan-style synagogue in New York, and he is putting on his shel yad, his hand tefillin, sitting down, and then he'll stand up for the shel rosh. I remember very clearly as a student in Yeshiva University, as a college student, and I was davening in a minyan there, and I don't know what day it was, clearly a weekday, and a boy not far from me was sitting down putting on his hand tefillin, and a rabbi walked by and said, "What's the matter with you? Stand up when you do that." And just showed, unfortunately, a little bit of ignorance in this particular area. You know,
Insensitivity.
well, you know, things are a lot more mixed together today than they were 50 years ago. And people tended to be more insular, didn't have the same ease of communicating and traveling that we do now, and they didn't know. They didn't know.
Isn't there also a difference in the direction in which you wind the shayag?
Ashkenazim, well, Hasidim go out, and Ashkenazim go in. And Sephardim go out as well. Hasidim do many things that they copied from Sephardim, because they followed the Ari, Rav Luria from Tzfat, and he was a Sephardi, and so they took his customs. I'm showing you this because in my community of Ashkenazim from Eastern Europe, a boy didn't wear a talis until he got married, unless he had an aliyah to the Torah. But not so in Sephardic communities. Boys would wear talitot either on Shabbat, even as a young child, and certainly from bar mitzvah age on, you would see that. So I'm just trying to point out to you differences that are visible and now maybe make a little more sense to you. Here is a lulav and etrog in the conventional way over here. Boy, is that a biased statement. In the Ashkenazi way over here, and over here in a Sephardi way, where the branches are tied directly to the lulav and not in any woven holder. Even though the woven holder is made out of dried lulav leaves, still the Sephardim tie it directly on. By the way, this particular individual has taken many more than 3 hadassim. That is, the Mishnah says that's permissible only for hadassim. You can't take 5 etrogim, you can't take 3 lulavim, you can't take 9 aravot. You can only multiply the hadassim. And I have a picture of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. He would take 36. I'm sure there's a mystical reason for that. The Torah style writing, Ashkenazim use a very sharp and detailed style. This is a Megillah, but it's written in the same style as a Torah is. And this is a Sephardi Torah. This piece is from Lech Lecha, Vayomer Hashem el Avram Lech Lecha. And you see that the style, well, let's look closer. You see that the style is rounder, softer, and not quite as detailed. This is Ladino, written in English letters, or I should say Latin letters. Querido hijo. If you read Spanish, you'll probably make sense out of a lot of it, because it is largely Spanish. Now, originally Ladino was written in Hebrew letters, but the modernization of the 20th century turned that into Latin characters. There isn't a lot of Jewish content in the postcard, but the last phrase says, Si quiere el Dios. Si quiere el Dios is Im Yirtzeh Hashem. And so, for me, that clinches it. This postcard was sent from Turkey to Tveria in Israel, Palestine at the time. Now you come to a book, it happens to be open over there on the table behind us. El Libro de la Ley, the law, that's the Torah, Los Profetas, the prophets, Neviim, and Los Escritores, the Ktuvim, scriptures, en la lengua española. Constantinople, 1873. The whole thing is in nothing but Ladino. Maybe you can read Ladino. In el principio creó el Dios los cielos y la tierra.
So it's in Rashi, then.
Bereshit bara Elokim et hashamayim ve'et haaretz. It is in what we call Rashi letters, but those letters have nothing to do with Rashi. Let me explain that a minute, because it's a common misconception. Rashi didn't write like this. What happened is that the earliest printers printed books of the Torah in the square print, sort of imitating the square print of a Torah itself. Then they wanted to include Rashi's commentary because they felt it was so useful. But they didn't want anybody to mix up the two, to think this is the Torah, this is the commentary, and you need to know the difference. One is the Word of God, the other is man interpreting and passing down the tradition. So they chose a different typeface. Today we would say font. So they chose this font, which was a rabbinic font. I have numerous letters written by Ashkenazi and Sephardi rabbis in this style of writing. But it became known as Rashi print because when you look in the Chumash, that's what you see. You see Rashi in this kind of print. Here's another page from there. Here, look, this should be easy. Honora a tu padre y a tu madre. Right. Now, this looks very lovely. There's actually a problem with this book. And it wasn't known initially. In fact, rabbis endorsed the book. Great idea! Now everybody can learn what the Chumash means. And then they discovered that there were funny things going on here. Here's a verse from Tehillim Parak Beis, last pasuk, and it says, Nashku bar. And our scroll would say that means do homage in purity. But lenashek could mean to kiss. And bar in Aramaic means a son. Bar mitzvah, right? So the guy who published this Tanakh was a missionary. And he translated it, kiss the son. And the son is capitalized S. So he was sneaking it in. Now the rabbis who endorsed the book didn't read all 24 books of the Bible before they gave their approbation, so they didn't realize. Over here, and this is Tehillim Kaf Beis, it says, "For dogs have encompassed me, a company of evildoers has enclosed me like a lion. They are at my hands and feet." But in the Ladino, they said that they pierced my hands and feet. Does that sound like something you've heard before? So, I bought the book innocently because I loved the idea of having a Ladino book printed in Turkey, but my brother-in-law, whose family comes from Turkey, knew about this book and found these places for me to show me that the book was, in fact, printed by missionaries.
How many converts do you think they got from this?
They were very active. I can't say, that's a different topic to research. I want to tell you that everything that I'm showing you could be a story just by itself. And I have 5,000 of these things going on in my house, and each one is worthy of research. But converts, missionaries were active among Sephardim and still are active in Israel, and find poor families and offer them meals and try to suck them in. And you know, organizations. When I was a boy in yeshiva, we went and stood on the corner near shul, and we collected money for Pe'ilim. And a person would give me a dime, I would give them this little paper square as like a receipt. Pe'ilim. Pe'ilim was to combat missionaries in Israel, and they're still doing it, and there's still Pe'ilim around.
We found a missionary sitter on Chumash in Barditchev.
Look at, wow, look at that. Look at that. They don't quit. Okay, this chart shows us Hebrew letters. You have the square, the script that most people today are familiar with, the style we call Rashi. It really should be called Rabbinic. And this, which is Ladino. Actually, I should call it Soletreo. Soletreo is a name for a style of writing, Hebrew, specifically and strictly among Sephardim, mostly Sephardim who maintained the Ladino tradition. And they would write their Ladino and their Hebrew in this script. I have been told that at a certain point in Israel's development, when they realized that there was a sort of clash of cultures, an Eastern and a European, they had to decide what would be the country's convention. What would we do that everybody could agree upon? Now, there was Ashkenazi type of Hebrew pronunciation, and there was Sephardi type of Hebrew pronunciation. There was Ashkenazi type of Hebrew writing, there was Sephardi type of Hebrew writing. So if you think about it a minute, Israel adopted essentially the Sephardi type of Hebrew pronunciation, but they agreed to adopt the Ashkenazi type of script writing. And therefore, this style, what's called Soletreo, is dying out. Only nuts who really want to study it are using it anymore. I have a number of letters and documents that are written in it, and I sit with my brother-in-law who learned it from his father, never used it in his life, but is fascinated by his past and tradition, and we work through the letters together. Here, for example, this is a calendar page from a Turkish Jewish calendar. Elul days. Here you have Shabbos, Shabbat, Shoftim. There's the Parsha. Anochi, Anochi is the Haftarah. Okay, Sof Zman Kriyat Shema, Motzei Shabbos. A lot of information. And on the bottom, in this Soletreo script, somebody has written names of people in the family whose yortzeit is on this week. By the way, yortzeit is one of those rare Yiddish words that is used by Sephardim, because they don't exactly have that word. And so you can find even Sephardic rabbis who will use the term. It's not easy for me to read. I can read this word, it's matzliach, which is a well-known Sephardi name, especially from Iraq. There it is. We won't take a lot of time. You look at letters and you think you know what they are, but you don't, because they're written differently. This is a tuf. See, this is bat.
Looks like Arabic.
You know, and we could spend a whole session just on that. This is an entire rabbinic legal document written in a rabbinic style solotreo. And it's a court decision about a piece of land in the old city of Yerushalayim. I'm still hoping to go with a guide and find this piece of land.
Yeah, that would be cool.
I don't know who will be on it today or who will be shooting me.
A Tarek Cohen.
But Tokonim, they are the people, I know.
I'm involved with them if you want to.
Beautiful. Well, I have gone on tours with them before, but once I got this document, I wanted to find the piece of land. But I want to show you some things. We don't need to read it, but look at these signatures. This is a typical Sephardi signatures. It's what I call razzle-dazzle. You know, they just made them very ornate to the point that they are just about illegible. And they always on the bottom have these two letters. Samach Tet. What does Samach Tet stand for? It very possibly stands for Siman Tov, but most people assume it stands for Sephardi Tahor. Pure Sephardi. And that would mean not intermarrying. I think that in the old days it must have meant, you know, in the days when there were the conversos and the pressure to convert, somebody who held themselves and stayed with the program could be proud of it. But, you know, in more modern times where there's a lot of mixing, they use this term. Here's this thing close up. This actually says, believe it or not, Chaim Yitzchak. Pizanti. There's a Pei, Yud, Zayin, Aleph, Nun, Tet, Yud. And Samach Tet. It's there, even if you have to look for it. This is Nisim Shemuel Yehuda. And he writes Yehuda with an Aleph, not a Hey. Like many Ashkenazim also do. I had an uncle Yudah, because they want to avoid that Yud, Hey, Vav configuration, which is almost God's name. And Samach Tet for Sephardi Tahor. I'm going to skip this because I know you're not going to stay with me forever. This is written from Cairo to Alexandria in Judeo-Arabic. The letters are Hebrew. There are some names, but it's another of the languages that Sephardim used. This is a Persian miniature. And there is a text here. It says Devarim on top. Most of the other words don't make any sense to me at all. They're not Hebrew. They're Judeo-Persian. But there are occasional words that pop out. Here, it says here, Rabbi Elazar. So I know that they're talking about something Jewish, and hopefully this picture relates to whatever they're talking about, but I don't really know. But Persia was famous for its miniature artworks, and these pages survive. This is straight pure Arabic. Beautifully written. It's Tehillim. It's Tehillim. I don't have the whole book, I just have the one page.
Can you get it closer, please? Closer?
Oh, I didn't bring that here. You can see it closer on my computer after, okay? You could read it for us? I had somebody work on translation because I didn't know what the page was. And then I typed in some of the words of the translation, and I found that it's a Perek. It's Perek Ayin Gimel in Tehillim. Now, I don't know, I can't imagine there are Arabs who need to read Tehillim in Arabic, although I suppose there could be scholars.
Excuse me.
Yes.
For Passover,
Yes.
we used to say it in Hebrew and then Arabic.
But the Arabic was written in Hebrew letters or Arabic letters? Arabic letters. Okay, so there you have it.
Why was that red?
It's obviously a special phrase, but we're going to ask one of our guests to tell me, because I can make out letters in Arabic, but I cannot read them. Okay, some costumes. This is Algeria, young woman. Femme juive.
So women covered their faces like that? And
Sometimes. She's indoors. The real issue was outdoors. You had to be careful. Here are some assorted rabbinic clothing. They usually wore some kind of a cap with a shmata wrapped around it, like this. And often these pantalones with high socks, not necessarily compression hosed, but they look like it.
They look like the Bedouins.
This is a girls' school in Tunisia, and they had to wear these, they look like party hats, but they weren't. They had to wear this costume, and so did their moms. This was required dress by the authorities. And we see leggings and a mid-length type of tunic, and then over that something else. They're pretty covered up. Here, as another example, Jews from Libya. Libya was taken over by Italy in 1912, so you see things written in Italian a lot from Libyan, even Jews. And you see what they're wearing. It's kind of semi-modern. Okay, I mean, if we looked at what Americans were wearing in 1912, it wouldn't be all that different. This is the postcard says Médecin Juif. This is a Jewish doctor from Iran. And he really looks Alibaba-ish if you look at the clothing there. And now look at this one. See what it says on the bottom? 2 centuries meeting, the mother and the daughter. And so the old gives way to the newer. The era of picture postcards really flowered around the year 1900. Postcards were invented in the 1870s, but they were just things to write on. And once they figured out how to get images onto postcards, then roving reporters with their cameras would go and take pictures of anything they thought looked exotic, and those would be published in cards. And people would send cards to each other. They wouldn't even have a message. They would just say, hey, look at this. And they would see costumes, animals, places, good things, not such good things. And of course now it's 100 years later and it's a big area of collecting. I'm going to skip this. This is to tell you that life is not all rosy in the world of Sephardim. Letters written in French to the Red Cross in Geneva. It's Jelfa, a city in Algeria. But what you need to know is it's Camp de Jelfa. This was a concentration camp. And the Nazis, through the French, the Vichy French who cooperated with the Nazis, the French had a lot of influence in Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. They brought all of their nastiness to the communities of North Africa. And so a lot of times people think that the Shoah was more of an Ashkenazi phenomenon. It was devastating to the Balkans. It was devastating to Salonika. It was miserable for North Africa. The Holocaust hit the Sephardi community very hard. Here is an Iraqi stamp, a postage stamp. No problem. Send a letter. It's a child throwing a rock through a window. That's a lovely thing to commemorate on a stamp in general. Here, the window has a Magen David. And even though in the Middle Ages that was as much a Muslim symbol as a Jewish symbol, but During the 20th century, it was very much a Jewish symbol. This is from 1991. And the child, his clothing is in the colors of the Palestinian flag, the black, red, green, and white. And something that not everybody knows is that in the world of communal rules of Islam, it's okay for kids to throw stones and nobody could stop them. So when you hear about all that rock throwing in Israel that you hear about, it's not just that they don't have any guns, so they have to try to hurt us with stones. This is a tradition, a very old tradition. And because it's kids, what are you going to do to kids? And the fact that stones can hurt and kill, well, that's a small point. Amazing that such a postage stamp could go on a letter in our times. This is a ketubah. I know you can't read it. I just wanted to show the whole thing. I had to tape it on my wall. Here up close we see that it's from Shnat Chameshet Alafim Shva Meot Shtayim 5752 is 1952. 5712 is 1952. And this is Yaakov, who is known as Jack Edis. And he is from the family of Hamanoach, the late Abraham Edis. And he is marrying the young woman, Suzit, from her family and all of that. Let's see how much cash is involved. Okay. Asara alafim, 10,000, 555 lirot levanoniot. Okay, that's 10,555 Lebanese pounds. Okay. Yes, it's the ketubah. The ketubah always says. But that's not what I wanted to show you. I want to show you this. There is other stuff in here. And it's stuff Ashkenazim don't have. Okay? So let's see some of the other rules. Here. Okay. Shelo yisa isha acheret aleha b'chayeha. Don't take another woman in addition to her in her lifetime. Ela imkain shahata imo blank number of shanim ritzufim velo yadla lo zera shel kayam achas v'shalom. So we write in the number 10. We're not going to take an additional wife as long as this here one produces a child within the first 10 years of marriage. Well, that's kind of interesting. Now, it's not new. It's actually very old. It's actually the parsha from a week ago. Lech lecha. Vatikach Sarai eshet Avram et Hagar Mitzrit shivchata miketz eser shanim. Ding, ding, ding. Right? After 10 years of them being married in Israel, and Avram takes an additional wife. Says Rashi, Miketz ezer shanim moed hakavua leisha sheshahata ezer shanim velo yalda leva'ala chayav lisa acheret. And Rashi quotes the Gemara, Ksubos, and others, that the traditional understanding was that if this union did not produce a child, that there could be taken another wife. Now, I knew the story about Abraham and Sarah. I just didn't know that we were still doing this. What?
Doesn't say could take a wife, it's chayav. You're obligated.
Right. I think you're right. You caught it. I think nowadays there are other approaches to this situation, but certainly that's a remarkable thing to have in a ketubah. And by the way, just so we're here, just to add another point. This is about the money. V'lo yelech me'aza v'hala. Remember, we're in Lebanon, right? He shouldn't go any further than Gaza, umitzova v'hala, and he shouldn't go any further away than Tzova, which is Aleppo, unless he leaves her with money and food, and v'kasher yaskimu b'neihem, and it's agreed to. In other words, you don't just take off and leave your wife. So I found this to be very interesting.
Rabbi,
Oh, okay. I'm getting the hook. Yes, ma'am.
We don't need to forget that it's in Lebanon and the Muslim
Right.
right is to have not only one but a lot of women.
Yes.
Here, wives, sorry. Here it's different. We are laws, you can't marry more than one.
Right.
And that's
Thank you. Now, the Ashkenazim accepted a decree not to have more than one wife. They did that in the time of Rabbeinu Gershom 1,000 years ago. But in Muslim countries, there continued to be many families who had multiple wives. And so the comment is absolutely appropriate. Israel had to decide what to do with that when people from those countries came on Aliyah, and here they were simply doing nothing more than following lifelong traditions.
Rabbi,
1,000 years are up already.
I didn't say it had a limit.
No, but they,
Yeah. Who? Yes.
As I recall from my parents and grandparents, we did our custom, tradition, everything accordingly to the Torah, word by word, nothing different. He
Okay.
said, Asher Shanim, the Torah, Asher Shanim.
Right.
Yeah.
Although it was blank, it makes me think they could have written another number, but they wrote the usual number. Thank you.
Reminded me that we follow the Torah by word.
Yes.
Yeah.
By the way, this is some comment that I want to make. From my reading and my collecting and from my interacting with Sephardic families, a number of features that we should appreciate about them. One is they're very strong and tenacious hold on tradition. They don't change, and they don't quit, and they don't give up. They keep to what they know is right. And that is why they have such tremendous respect for their Rabbanim, because for them the Rabbanim represent what we have gotten from our previous generations going all the way back to Har Sinai. So the Sephardim stand out. Of course, there are many Jews that we could say that of, but as a community, they're very strong and tenacious in their customs. Another thing I want to say in a totally different vein is how, in general, friendly, worldly, personable the Sephardim that I have met tend to be. Very comfortable in the world, very comfortable interacting with the rest of the world and still maintaining who they are at home. It stands out in my mind based on my own experiences, and I'm sure that it's true elsewhere. All right, just a couple more, and I guess we'll knock it off. This is a Siddur printed in Egypt. It's you might say it's the art scroll Siddur of Egypt, because it has the Hebrew on one side and all the Arabic translation next to it. You could see that Siddur over there on the table. Interesting about this Siddur, all my life, whenever I held a Siddur that had a translation, the Hebrew was on the left and the English was on the right. Here, the Hebrew is on the right and the English is on the left. It's just an interesting change that Koren has been adopting. Right. This little nothing book with wormholes is a machzor, handwritten every letter in Yemen. I told you that I have a book from every Sephardic country, a Jewish book printed there, except from Yemen. They didn't have printing presses for Hebrew. I don't know what they had for Arabic. So in Yemen, every book was hand copied. every Shulchan Aruch, every Rambam, every Sidur, every Machzor. Now, Yemenites tended to know things by heart because books were scarce and expensive, and so they simply learned by heart. Yemenites are also famous, in those days anyway, for being able to read Hebrew from strange directions. Because if there would be a book in school, it would be one. And you'd have kids sitting around the table. So imagine if your position around the table was always on the top end and the book was facing the teacher. You learned to read upside down. And you didn't even think of it as upside down. You just read that way. That's because books were precious and scarce, and some have survived. It was thrilling for me to be able to acquire this one. This is Avinu Malkeinu, Kasvenu B'Sefer Chaim Tovim. It's the same stuff that everybody says. And this is, on the bottom, Kol Nidre. I threw this in because this has become a popular symbol. It comes from Eastern and Muslim countries, but the 5 fingers, the hand of God, the good luck, and so on. So it's become a popular symbol. And there is henna, which also Eastern countries use these kind of temporary tattooings as good luck. It was done before simchot, tzmachot, and especially at weddings to have a henna ceremony. And, okay, I can't do this piece now because of time, but I want to show you one thing. So I'm going to run through a lot of things just to show you one thing. These are all artifacts from Morocco.
Is there a place we can see it when you do it again? Beautiful.
Okay, here, let me just end with this because it is so memorable. In 1912, the French took over Morocco. They called it a protectorate. This was a nice way for European countries to control trade and business and other things going on in lucrative African markets. At that time, there was a lot of protest and rebellion, and not surprisingly, it played out in the Jewish quarter too, and this is what happened. People's homes are ruined. See, it's from Le Maroc Illustré. There's some journal, magazine, that sent photographers to capture this, and they published it. And then they were made into postcards. Here are people looking through the rubble of their homes because everything has been destroyed. But some people, 1912, April, but people didn't have a place to live. Now the local sultan was sympathetic. So he let them come and stay on the grounds of his palace. And here you see all kinds of refugees, so to speak, homeless Jews who had nowhere else to stay. And he had a zoo on his grounds with cages and wild animals. And here you see lions in this cage and people in this one. They're not there as captives. They were given shelter because they had no place to go. Those of you who read French can see it says deux pièces de la ménagerie du sultan. It's the zoo of the sultan. And 2 cages, right? L'un occupé par les lions et l'autre par les Israélites.
Wow.
Isn't that unbelievable? So we all have our past, our stories, our tragedies, and our triumphs. And it's good for us to appreciate each other and the rich background that we have. Thank you so much for listening.
I'd like to thank Rabbi Yaakov for being with
We're
us.
up to you,
I look forward
Dr.
to having you again to complete
of course.
this entire study.
There's a lot
So
more.
everybody,
When did you graduate
if you would
Shiva College?
please bring the waste from your tables up to
I was
the front.
class of 59.
Representative Dodd, with your waste,
58. Okay.
okay?
Maybe
Everybody
before
get up
Tisha
and
B'Av.
get themselves.
Well, then we should do the other kind of stuff. We had Yerushalayim or
Coins, the
Matbeos.
coins that you have.